Kids say some of the dumbest stuff sometimes. Now, don't get me wrong. I would die for my 5-year-old son. I love him more than I love myself. But that doesn't make his commentary any more meaningful. Any parent who's had to explain why jelly beans can't go in the toaster will comprehend. And every parent who's had to clean melted jelly beans out of the toaster will emphasize. So, Daddy, there's something scary under the bed. Had gotten old long before my wife and I loaded Liam into the car to begin the 2-day trip to her parents' house for Thanksgiving. It's your turn, I mumbled to Stacy as I rolled over on the pull-out bed. Last time I had to clean the entire bottle of Gatorade pee, she huffed. That counts for 2. Besides, he called for you. She pushed me to the edge of the uncomfortable bed. And sighing, I stood up and shambled over to the minuscule twin bed on the other side of the room and sat down on the mattress. Liam, do you remember that I need to get a good night's sleep so I won't crash the car while I'm driving tomorrow? But something's moving under the mattress, he whispered in a voice that was inappropriately dramatic. I rubbed my eyes before trying to focus on Liam's silhouette in the faint moonlight. Matt's one of my best friends from college, and he's being very generous to let us stay in his house. I'm sure he'd give us a room without any monsters in it. That usually calms him down. Usually, but not always. This was one of those not always moments. Liam wheezed like he was finishing the final stretch of the Boston Marathon, which meant that I could either check under the bed for potential threats or spend the next 30 minutes mopping up piss. The tapping is coming from beneath my pillow. Check that part of the bed first, he gasped. And I'll be honest, that part made my hair stand up just a little as I got to my hands and knees. Okay, Liam, I announced as I lifted the edge of the sheet. I'm sticking my head under the bed right now and... Damn, it stank. What was Matt keeping under here? I blinked, struggling to see in a space where the moonlight barely reached. The first thing I recognized was the eye. It stared at me, just inches away from my nose. I really didn't want to move because that would mean accepting what I was seeing is real. The hand on my wrist forced me into action. Her grip was slimy and gritty, and it left a cold, wet, and coppery smelling residue on my skin. I pulled away and I scrambled to my feet, very angry with gravity for confusing me. I'll admit that a tiny, selfish part of my brain contemplated running away from Liam and heading out the door. But I ignored that thought, and I leapt forward, scooping my son up from the bed and turning around. It was enough time for a clammy hand to find my ankle. This time, her grip felt like ice, but I broke away and I stumbled to the pull-out bed, crashing into Stacy as Liam screamed. That was enough for her to get from asleep to fully standing in a quarter of a second. Dave, what are you... And she didn't finish. The woman now crawling out from Liam's bed was visible even in the dim moonlight. It was my turn for an inappropriate piss as I realized that she was standing between us and the door. Still urinating, I grabbed my son in one arm and my wife in the other and I ran for the window. We had just enough time to crawl out onto the roof before she reached us. The next couple of hours were a blur. I like to say that I climbed down from the roof gracefully, but I'm trying to stay as honest as possible. Without our keys or our cell phone, we had to pound on a neighbor's door until she woke up. The police arrived faster than answers did. Matt was taken away in handcuffs and the woman was taken away in an ambulance. And the truth eventually found its way to us. Matt had been kidnapping and torturing people, mostly women, for years. He pulled the tongue from the mouth of the victim beneath Liam's bed, and she'd actually been begging us for help as she bled to death. She didn't survive. Matt hadn't been planning on letting us leave his home with his knowledge. He'd been waiting in the hall, intending to catch us as we ran out. Apparently, capturing people in the moment of panic is the biggest thrill for him. He hadn't counted on us climbing out of the 2-story window, and that's the only reason that we're alive. He'd already killed 19 people, and another 13 were trapped in various places within his home in various makeshift torture chambers. At first, I'd refused to believe that one of my best friends was capable of what prosecutors claimed. But that was before they showed me his notebook, which documented the grisly details of each murder. And at the end of it, 5 pages had been set aside for Stacy, Liam, and I. He is going to make me choose one of them to get tortured first, then force me to watch every second of it. So that's how my Thanksgiving travel plans went awry. I hope yours played out better. I doubt Liam will be able to sleep alone until he's a teenager. And to be honest, I don't blame him. He's seen the world for the worst that it can be. Kids really do say the dumbest things sometimes. But that can't comprehend to the magnitude of adults who do some of the scariest things. Sometimes. There was something unbelievable about the stuffing my grandmother made every Thanksgiving. It wasn't just good, it was beyond amazing. Every morsel of meat and bread and vegetable was flavored to perfection. The meticulousness and love involved in the preparation process shone through with every bite. We'd eat until we were stuffed, pun intended, and still felt great afterward. Hell, we even felt invigorated, which was the last thing one would ever expect after Thanksgiving dinner. Our family had been trying to tell her to give us the recipe for years. She wouldn't even give us a hint. Since our family has always had a love for dark humor, when we're around the Thanksgiving table, we like to speculate on how she did it. My sister thought that she mixed crack cocaine, and my father said that she sold her soul to Satan in 1955. Even Mom, who was the least indecorous of the group, quietly sat around a mouthful of stuffing. I bet it's made from the bodies of better chefs. And we all laughed, especially Grandma. Then we had a little moment of sad silence, because Grandpa had been a chef. He'd passed away over the summer, and everyone missed him. Dad broke the silence with a truly spectacular belch, and we all groaned and giggled and got back to eating. Even though I'd resumed packing my mouth with mashed potatoes, I still felt bad for my grandmother. She'd taken Grandpa's death very hard. Even with her network of friends, family, and co-workers at the place where she volunteers, her loneliness was obvious. Seeing her smiling with us on Thanksgiving warmed my heart. It felt good to hear her laugh again, and it was obvious that she was happy that we loved her stuffing as much as she did. The Friday after last Thanksgiving, I'd finished my Black Friday shopping and was bringing my niece's presents over to Grandma's. It was a tradition for us to go there on Christmas morning to open our gifts. I wanted to get in an early start so I wouldn't have to deal with last-minute shopping. When I arrived, Grandma wasn't there. I figured that she was doing her volunteering since it's always busy there around the holidays. I had a key though, and I let myself in. Her house was as neat and perfect as ever, and I left the packages on the living room, and was about to leave through the kitchen when a truly sinister thought crossed my mind. I was finally going to get that stuffing recipe. I opened her recipe book, and there between souffle and tandoori chicken was stuffing. And I read it over, and my heart sank. It was completely unremarkable. The recipe looked like any ingredient list from the back of a stuffing box. There was only one thing that I didn't recognize right away. 1/4 cup of STC. I scratched my head for a second and then realized that it was an abbreviation for salt, turmeric, and cumin. And after all those years of wondering, it all came down to Grandma just being a really, really good cook. I should have known. It's been almost a year since then. The family has been gearing up for another Thanksgiving. The menu is planned, the tablescape is designed, and the guests have been invited. Yesterday, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. Her mother, aka my grandma, had been arrested. I couldn't believe it and asked what had happened, and Mom replied that she'd been caught stealing from the place where she volunteers. They had security camera footage and everything. To say that I was confused was a massive understatement. First of all, how could my grandmother, the kindest, sweetest person I've ever met, be a thief? And second, what the hell is there to steal from where she volunteers? Mom went to the police station to deal with the situation while I stayed at home and cleaned. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. As far as my first concern, I chalked it up to Grandma just maybe getting old. Maybe she'd gotten confused and had taken something without even knowing it, and it didn't belong to her. That had to be it, and it made me sad to think about it. Mom called me an hour or so later. She had bailed Grandma out and was waiting for it to all get processed as she took her to the hospital to get examined. And I asked Mom what the hell was going on. And she had told me pretty much exactly what we thought. Grandma had taken something from the volunteer place and snuck it away. The security officers even rolled tapes back and caught her doing the same thing for the last 8 years. And all around Thanksgiving. What the hell did she take? I asked, so overwhelmed with confusion that I wanted to tear my hair out. Well, that's why I'm bringing her to the hospital, Mom replied. Not just because I think that she might be losing it, but because it was just waste that the place incinerates anyway. And I felt a chill start at the back of my neck and plunge down my spine. Like medical waste? I asked in a hollow, detached voice. Yeah, biohazard stuff. I thanked Mom for calling and said to let me know if there was anything that I could do to help. And we hung up. And I sat there in the quiet house and put seemingly impossible pieces together. The stuffing, the feeling of invigoration, the recipe. Everything in the room blurred and my mouth felt very, very dry. STC wasn't salt, turmeric, and cumin. Not even close to salt, turmeric, and cumin. STC was stem cells. Grandma was a volunteer at Planned Parenthood. I'd always known that my great-great-grandmother was an orphan, but in late October of last year, she decided to tell me the truth about what happened to her family. We were visiting her for her birthday. It was a tradition in our household, a road trip that we knew in the back of our minds we'd only take a few more times. She was turning 98, so that was just the cold hard truth of the matter. In my childhood, the journey to central Iowa had been a fun and light-hearted affair. But now my brother and parents could only maintain stained politeness as we met up and hit the road together. Each of us knew that this trip might be our last. For several years, we drove through vast open farm fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. My great-grandmother's house was down a narrow dirt road off of wide dirt road off of a gravel tractor lane. As a city boy, it was, more or less, the most remote possible dwelling that I could imagine. She was born there, had lived there her entire life, and would soon, well. As we parked in an open muddy rectangle and stepped out to stretch our legs, the consistency of the place surrounded me. Every single year of my life, the house and land had been exactly the same. The sky was open blue, the earth was a sea of waving gold, and the wind was a smooth river of cool warmth. There was never anything to mar those 3 pillars of sensory experience except the house, the barn, a defunct old tractor, and the bell. The bell was a simple thing raised high on an old metal crook. It sat out in the fields about a quarter mile from the house, serving as a measure of the wind. If a storm was coming, the bell was supposed to ring, a necessary precaution in tornado country. The only problem was, the bell and its hook had rusted over long ago. Every time I got out of the family van from age 5 to age 26, I glanced in that direction, felt a sense of unease as my gaze fell upon the decayed artifact. This time, at age 27, I looked over and I saw that the bell had been scraped and polished clean of rust. It glinted in the sunlight, practically daring me to look at it. And I followed my family inside while struggling with a feeling of dread that I couldn't articulate. Who had cleaned the bell? And why? I tried to stop thinking about it as we gathered in the kitchen and said our hellos, only returning to the present when my great-grandmother brought in the tea. And we had a nice time. That night, when everyone else was long asleep, I happened to open my eyes and see a glow under the door of the guest room that I shared with my brother. My parents were in a different room and could not see the same light, so it was up to me to investigate. Quietly, as not to wake them, I crept out and down, finding my great-grandmother still awake. She sat in her big jade leather chair, her gaze on the television. She asked me without looking my way, "You don't fall for this stuff, do you?" "What, like ads?" She pointed her thin little arm at the nearby couch. "Sit." And I sat. "I'm going to tell you a family secret," she said softly, finally looking my direction. "It's for you, and possibly for your brother, but not your parents. Do you understand?" I didn't, not fully, but I nodded. "You know I was an orphan for a time, born in this house and lived with my family, but then raised by an uncle after it happened." She didn't wait for my nod. "I was 10 years old that night. It was my birthday." "My mother had gotten me a small cake about the size of your fist. I looked forward to that cake every year, since we didn't exactly have sweets bounding about back then. It was 11 cents, so rather expensive. But my mother had gotten one for every one of us on our birthdays, no matter what she had to scrimp or save. And all year long, I saw Mary get her cake in January, Arthur get his cake in March, Eleanor in June, and Clarence in July, and then Ruth a week after Clarence. Then it was months and months until me, the odd one out, on October 29th. I was so excited for that cake, and as the days rolled closer and as the morning dawned, as the hours inched by, I hopped around the house like a bunny rabbit. But I wasn't allowed to eat it until well after supper. I stared at the clock, so I know. Yes, that one on the mantel there, the brass and the chrome one. It's the same one. But I stared at that clock, so I know. Night fell at 6:41. That was the moment bright orange stopped glinting off the clock and my mother rose to light a lamp. I looked up at her. "Now?" And she smiled and shook her head. My brothers and sisters complained in a chorus in support of me, but she just shook her head at them. "Too soon, and she'll ruin her supper." Father came in from the fields not long after that, dirty and tired as all get out. He ate in silence while we chattered endlessly about the type of cake it would be. Under the frosting, who knew? It might be raspberry, vanilla, or even chocolate. And we grew silent as Father neared the cleaning of his plate, an event which would mark the end of supper. 4 pieces of meat and bread remained, and then 3, and then 2, and any moment now. He stopped at the last piece, holding it unmoving above the remaining dollop of gravy, and we turned our heads. It was the bell. The bell was ringing in the fields. Father grunted and then put the last piece of food back onto his plate before rising. He opened the front door and we braced ourselves for the wind, but none came. He spat on and held up a finger to the night air, and then shook his head. He moved back into the lamplight and sat. And Arthur asked, "Is it gonna storm?" And then Mary asked, "Is there gonna be a tornado?" My mother shook her head, smiling at us, and told us not to worry. No wind meant no storm. But that bell kept ringing. My father dipped his last piece of food in the gravy and prepared to eat it despite the constantly ringing bell, but then sighed and put it back down, and he motioned to Clarence. Clarence was the oldest, so he understood. He was nearly a man himself, and so tying the bell would be no problem. He grabbed a candle, protected the flame with his hand, and headed out to the open front door. My brothers and sisters and I piled up into the window, opening it, and we found nothing but absolutely still, chilly air. We watched his little spot of light move around the house and into the fields and in the direction of the bell. The clanging metallic sound stopped, finally, and the candle's little flame hovered next to it for a solid minute. And then Ruth asked, "Why is he taking so long to tie it?" And I remember Eleanor suggesting maybe he's having trouble making a knot. Knots are tough. And we watched for another minute or two before, and I know how this sounds. The little flame in the distance began to rise, slowly and smoothly straight up. We followed it with our eyes, exclaiming the entire time as it moved out of sight beyond the roof overhang. And the bell began ringing again. I remember Arthur joking, saying that his knot must have come loose. And our parents came to look at our insistence, but there was nothing to see by them. Father motioned to Arthur, happy to help out. Arthur grabbed a full lamp rather than a candle. He hurried out the front door, around the house, and into the fields while we watched from the window. The lamp was easier to see, and we were absolutely certain that he reached the crook. And as the lamp light hovered there, the bell stopped ringing. And at that point, we had no reason to think anything was amiss. Maybe the wind had just blown a wisp of the burning candle string up into the sky and Clarence had gotten lost in the dark. He would see the lamplight, find Arthur, and they would both come back. The rising little flame that we'd seen had just been a fluke. Only problem was, staring out into the autumn night, we still felt no wind at all. And we stared at that unmoving light for a strangely long period of time. We wondered what he was doing out there. Was he calling for our brother? Why couldn't we hear him if so? Our parents looked away for a moment, and in that instant, the lamp went out. We children bleated, but by the time that they glanced back, there was nothing to see. There was only darkness. And the bell began ringing again. My father began grumbling, but there was no more sons to send outside. He narrowed his eyes with thought and then handed Ruth, the oldest girl among us, our main lamp. And our mother laughed. "Ruth, be a dear and go find your silly brothers." Ruth was a little hesitant, but she accepted the lamp, leaving us in darkness without it. She headed out around the house and into the fields. This lamp was brighter, and we could actually see her carrying hand and her white pajamas in a small lit halo. And on the way there, she regularly called out, "Clarence! Arthur! Are you two lost?" And about halfway to where the other two lights had stopped, her calls went instantly silent mid-sentence. "Clarence! Arthur!" It wasn't that she'd given up yelling. The sound reaching us had simply stopped completely. We could still see her carrying the lamp, still see her hand in pajamas, still see her turning this way and that. She even raised the house lamp near her face, and we saw her shouting into the darkness. We just didn't hear anything. Nothing except that constantly clanging bell, growing faster in pace and louder in urgency. Mary, Eleanor, and I looked up at our parents with fearful gazes. My father shook his head, speaking for the first time that night. "So there's wind out there after all. The air is like a river inside an ocean. It's moving fast out there, carrying her voice away, but we can't feel it in here." My mother seemed worried, but she nodded and accepted that. We saw her accepting it, so we gulped and believed it too. And we all glued our eyes to that open window. And Ruth reached the bell, and in that stronger light, it entered our view unmoving at the exact time that we heard it stop ringing. Ruth looked this way and that, clearly concerned. She seemed to silently yell a time or two before moving closer to the motionless bell. A half-tied rope hung from the crook, an indication that someone had attempted to tie it, but we couldn't see Clarence or Arthur anywhere near her. She put the lamp down on the ground to free her hands for tying the rope the rest of the way, but that mostly hid the light among the low-lying, recently harvested stalks. And we waited. Breaths held. And the air held in my lungs started to burn. And at long last, we were forced to breathe again. Ruth's light continuing to sit there, barely visible between the broken plants. "What's taking so long?" Mary asked, and Eleanor said, "I hope that she's all right." And Father told us she's fine. Damn kids are just playing a game with us. And our mother nodded in agreement. "Eleanor, go fetch your sister, will you?" And Eleanor shook her head, saying, "No, it's scary out there. It's just a game. You're not playing a game with us too, are you?" "And no," Eleanor said as she gulped. "Then go get your sister and brothers and tell them to come back in." It was pitch black out there and almost the same inside with us, save for one lone candle. Trembling, Eleanor took our last candle and crept it into the night, scooting along the side of the house to stay as close to us as possible. Shakily, she called, "Ruth! Arthur! Clarence, this isn't funny anymore!" And now it was just we who sat in the dark. As Eleanor began to move further away with the last of our light, and we tensed. Father eyed the open front door, and Mother softly moved to close and latch it. And I wondered what they meant by that move. Because how were the others supposed to get back in? But I supposed that they'd unlatch it if anyone came back and knocked. And Mother moved away from us in search of more candles, and through it all, the bell kept ringing out in the dark. Increasingly scared, I held Mary's hand tightly and yelled out the window, "Be careful, Ellie!" She must have happened to cross that invisible, silent threshold at that moment because she turned around in surprise and stepped closer. "I heard your voice go quiet, but there's no wind. Papa's wrong." She stepped away again. "See, when I pass the point, my..." She held up the candle to show us that her mouth was still moving, but we heard nothing. Come to think of it, her hair wasn't moving, and we hadn't seen Ruth's pajamas billowing in the wind. I asked Father, "What's doing that? What's making it quiet out there?" "It's just a game," Father insisted. "They're all lying. She's just pretending to make noise so it looks like she's being silenced." And Eleanor reached the bell. Father's grip on my shoulder squeezed, nearly painful. She reached down for the bell Ruth had left, lifting it with one hand and holding the candle with the other as she approached the clanging bell. "See," Mary whispered to Father, "the candle's not going out, even though she's not protecting the flame. There's no wind out there." "But the bell is ringing," he said gruffly. "So there is wind." And Eleanor kept looking left and right as if she heard something, and slowly she reached the bell, which was hanging unmoving from the crook, but we could still hear it ringing. And next to me, Mary began to cry. "It's a game," Father said angrily. "It's just a game that they're playing." And Eleanor threw the lamp at something in the darkness, and we saw the lamp crash, shatter, and go dark, but heard nothing. And she raced towards us, candle in hand, but the flame went out because of her haste. We waited to hear her approaching or screaming, but nothing followed. And the bell continued to clang. We waited in terrified silence. Mother returned with a candle for each of us, and we sat vigil at the window. Nothing and no one moved. For hours, the bell clanged without wind. The night remained pitch black, and the bell clanged and clanged and clanged, driving deeper into our ears with each passing minute. And near midnight, we broke. Father was beyond agitated. "Mary, go find your brothers and sisters." "No," she cried. "I'm not going out there." And Mother glared at her. "You have to. The game has to stop." Urged on by both of them, Mary burst into tears and climbed out the window. Holding her small candle, she inched out onto the field. And her sobs went quiet as she passed the same point in the darkness. Her flame reached the bell and the ringing stopped. And her flame snuffed out. And we held our breaths. The bell began ringing again, and Father clenched his fists. "Go!" And I turned and I saw that he was looking at me, and I suddenly realized that I was the only child left in the house, and I felt horribly alone. And everything in me shrieked against the thought of going out into that cursed night. "No." My mother wavered in place. No longer adamantly in line with my father, she began to cry too. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "It's just a game. There's nothing to be scared of." And she screamed and demanded, "Why do you keep saying that? Why have I been helping you do this?" And he grabbed her and shouted in her face, "Because we haven't been sending our children to their deaths. That's not what's happening." And she pushed his hand away and ran for the window, pushing past me and tumbling out, and ran screaming towards the still clanging bell, not out of fear of Father, but out of terror of her children. "Arthur, Clarence, Ruth, Eleanor, Mary, for God's sake, where are you?" And he growled and leapt after her, yelling, "We didn't kill them. Everything is fine." And they both continued shouting until they passed the point of the dark, and all went silent, except for the bell. Twice more it stopped ringing, and twice more it began again. In panic and terror beyond reason, I closed and latched the window and pushed all of the furniture against every entry in the house. I curled into a cupboard, holding the last candle up to my face as it slowly melted its way towards my fingers. I was alone. And somehow, I was alone. We'd all seen the danger and stared right at it as it happened. But one by one, they'd all gone out there anyway. I'd been surrounded by a full band of siblings my entire life, and now I was completely and utterly alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. And by the length of my candle, it was 3 a.m. when the knock came to the door. I trembled but did not make a sound. The knock sounded again. 40 heartbeats later, it was louder this time. I shook, holding my candle tight. The third knock was more like a tremendous crash or a kick, and I heard the door explode inward. And 60 heartbeats of silence passed, and then the floorboards creaked. Something in me told me to put out my candle for fear of it being seen through the cracks in the cupboards, but I didn't dare. Not darkness. I couldn't handle darkness. I would scream if I did, so I kept it lit. And slow, quiet steps moved through the house. Whoever it was seemed to be pausing and listening at times, and at others they would rush forward to a random spot in a sudden frenzy and then stop abruptly. And 400 heartbeats after that, the bell began ringing again. But this time it rang from inside the house. It rang from the kitchen, and it rang from near the bed. It rang outside my cupboard, 10 feet away. 5 feet away. Right up against the cupboard door. And then it opened. I sat expectantly, mouth open and eyes wide, as I waited for my great-grandmother to continue. And after a bit, I realized that was it. But what did you see? And she shook her head. That's not the point. I'm here, so obviously I survived. And a young man like you doesn't need to know what horrors walk this world outside the paved cities of man. And gulping, I asked, "You're not just pulling my leg, are you, Grandma? I mean, This really happened? Yes. Her gaze went distant by television light. But here's what I wanted to tell you, and what you should tell your brother. The thing that opened that cupboard door and stared at me from the dark. The thing that hoped to wait out my candle before the coming of dawn. Had a bell tied to one of its teeth with a blood-soaked rag, such that it would clang when its mouth was opening for hunting. And somehow, some way, some heroic poor soul managed to tie a warning bell to that thing before they died. We heard that warning bell all night long, and yet my entire family walked out there one by one. We didn't listen because we didn't want to listen. My father knew what he was doing halfway through, but he didn't want to accept what he'd already done. So he did even worse to continue living the lie. I narrowed my eyes. What are you saying? She grabbed my hand briefly. Fear will tell you to put your candle out, but your head will tell you to keep it lit. Do not give in to fear. You keep it lit. You will get through this. And turning my head, I became aware of a sound in the distance. Is that the bell? I was so caught up I didn't notice. How long has that been ringing? She just clenched her fist and turned back to the television.
And now, miss, what can I do for you? This is your new secretary. Oh, yes, you're from the Kilbride School.
Yes, I am. Say, look at that. She knocked over a bottle of ink all over the carpet, and it's going to be hard to get out, too.